Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Critical Issues Forum online teachers workshop. So for those who are watching the recorded video at a later time, thank you for watching the lecture video. I would like to start the first lecture of the workshop. Today's lecture title is Nuclear Weapons in the World. Where are we? How did we get here? And what might the future hold? This lecture is going to give you an overview of the current nuclear weapons status in the world. I am delighted to have Ms. Sarah Bidgood for the CIF workshop. Sarah is a Senior Research Associate and Project Manager at the James Madison Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. Her areas of research include US-Soviet and US-Russia Non-Proliferation Cooperation, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, review process, Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, or CTBT, as well as non-proliferation and disarmament diplomacy. Previously, Sarah was a graduate research assistant at CNS and the project manager for the graduate initiative in Russian studies. Sarah is a member of the CTBTO youth group, and she served as an intern at the United Nations for Office for Disarmament Affairs during the 2015 NPT Review Conference. She has extensive experience in nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament diplomacy. In addition, she is currently assisting Dr. William Potter, CNS Director, with a graduate level course that simulates the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. So she's quite up to date on what is going on in the field of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. Before coming to Montreal, she worked in the field of scientific publishing as a managing editor and peer review manager. Sarah earned her BA in Russian from Wellesley College. She also holds an MA in Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and an MA in Non-Proliferation and Terrorism Studies from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. So I am so happy to have Sarah for this year's CIF workshop. And Sarah is going to give one more lecture later this week. So Sarah, I will give you a microphone and I'm going to mute myself. So that stage is yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Masako, for that kind introduction. And it's my pleasure to be with those of you who are watching live and for those of you watching the recording. Today, we're going to be talking, as Masako said, about nuclear weapons in today's world. So I'd like to focus initially on where we are today, providing a status update. Then I'd like to go back a little bit in history and look at how we got here. And then we'll finish off the presentation by doing some speculating about what the future might hold. So this slide just provides an overview of what I'm hoping to cover in today's session. And before we get started, I want to be sure to call to your attention a couple of key terms that we're going to go over and explore in depth over the next 45 minutes. The first one of these is, of course, the concept of proliferation and its counterpart, non-proliferation. In the context of today's talk, we're going to be exploring the concept of both vertical proliferation, which means when states which already possess nuclear weapons either develop more nuclear weapons or new types of nuclear weapons, and correspondingly, the concept of horizontal proliferation, which is when countries that don't currently possess nuclear weapons either acquire them or begin to develop them themselves. We'll also talk a bit about arms control, which means limits on either the numbers of nuclear weapons, on the numbers of delivery systems that are used to deliver nuclear weapons, or certain practices related to the development of nuclear weapons, such as nuclear testing. And in concert, all of these ideas are going to contribute to an understanding or a summing up of how close or how far away we are from the goal of nuclear disarmament, which of course means eliminating all of the nuclear weapons that are currently on the planet. So we'll move through the presentation exploring some opportunities for advancing the disarmament agenda and also some challenges that stand in the way of pursuing this goal. So this first slide just provides an overview of where the global nuclear arsenals are today and how many nuclear warheads make up these arsenals. And I should say at the outset, although this is probably well known to you already, that nuclear weapons are very powerful weapons and they are much more destructive than conventional weapons. And so that's why this is such a focus and such an important topic of our work here. They're also very difficult to develop, which is part of the reason why only 9 countries possess them today. The countries that have nuclear weapons are listed on this very helpful slide that the Arms Control Association has put together based on open source information and information from the Department of State. The countries that we'll be looking at are Russia, the United States, France, China, the United Kingdom, Pakistan, India, Israel, and the DPRK, which is North Korea. The first 5 of these, so Russia, the United States, France, China, and the UK, are what are sometimes referred to as the official nuclear weapons states. So those are the states that are designated as nuclear weapons possessors by the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is something that we're going to talk about a little bit later in the presentation. And the other states are typically referred to as nuclear weapons possessors. So what do we see when we look at this slide? Well, it's pretty obvious that Russia and the United States possess orders of magnitude more warheads than the other countries that are listed on this graph. And in fact, about 90% of the world's 15,000 warheads are in US and Russian possession. If you take a closer look at the graph, you'll see that these numbers are divided up. So some of the warheads that are shown on the graph are retired, which means that they are no longer in the national stockpiles of these countries, but they haven't yet been dismantled. Other of the weapons are stockpiled, which means that they have not been mounted onto a delivery system. They're demated, but they could be used on a delivery system. And then others of these, the ones that are sort of in the shaded lines, are deployed nuclear weapons. So they've been mounted onto ballistic missiles and they're at aircraft bases. There is a long history of mechanisms that are aimed at reducing these numbers. And US Soviet and US Russian arms control, which you'll remember means reducing the number of weapons, reducing the number of delivery systems, and reducing practices, have been pretty effective at reducing the nuclear arsenals overall. But nevertheless, nuclear disarmament continues to feel quite far off when you look at charts like these. So we'll discuss a little bit later how the crisis in US-Russia relations will probably impact the future of arms control. And we'll also look at how changes in the new US nuclear posture under the new administration might impact this. But another question to consider as you look at this is whether you feel like there's the potential for these arsenals to be reduced to 0 at some point, or whether when you see things like this, it makes you feel that disarmament is a pretty long ways off. So this slide deals with the topic of fissile material. And as you know, nuclear weapons are made out of fissile material, which just logically means material that is capable of undergoing fission. And when we talk about nuclear weapons and fissile material, really what we mean specifically is plutonium and uranium. So these 2 charts were created by the International Panel on Fissile Materials, and they're up to date as of 2015, so a couple of years ago. When we talk about uranium in the context of nuclear weapons, we're talking about highly enriched uranium. And here are 2 charts that show information about highly enriched uranium production, both over time and what the current stockpiles look like globally. So the left graphic shows highly enriched uranium production from the period of about 1945 to, as I said, 2015. And you can see that production really peaked in about 1985, and that it's decreased quite dramatically since that period. However, the overall inventory is still huge, especially compared with what is contained in the actual warheads themselves. So you can see on this graph that there's the equivalent of about 16,000 warheads worth of highly enriched uranium that are currently used in nuclear weapons, but there's another about 38,000 additional weapons equivalent in the amount of HEU that is contained in the global stockpile. So on the right, you can see estimates of the current stocks of highly enriched uranium, as well as the amount of uranium that has been eliminated so far. And if you look closely at these graphs, you'll see that it contains both highly enriched uranium that's used for civilian purposes and also for military purposes. And highly enriched uranium that's used for civilian purposes includes HEU that's used in the fuel for example, nuclear research reactors. And then you also have highly enriched uranium used in the fuel for nuclear submarines. So this is a lot of numbers when you look at it, and what does it all mean when taken in total? In general, we can conclude that there was a lot more material for making nuclear weapons in the past than there is today, but there's still quite a bit of it today. And all of the P5 countries that we talked about before, Russia, the United States, France, China, and the United Kingdom have stopped the production of highly enriched uranium, but it's believed that the other 4 are continuing production. Beyond its implications for disarmament, fissile material stockpiles can also pose security concerns. And in that respect, it's really important to keep these stockpiles safe from terrorists, from people who would sell them on the black market, that type of thing. So from this standpoint, part of the non-proliferation concern surrounding fissile material has to do with thinking about ways to reduce this amount of material worldwide, since if it exists in these stockpiles, it's vulnerable to non-state actors. And so we'll look at some prospects that states parties have come up with for ways to reduce fissile material stockpiles worldwide a little bit later on in the presentation. So this slide addresses nuclear testing and where we are currently with nuclear testing. Historically, testing has been an important way for aspiring nuclear weapon states to develop nuclear weapons, but it's also a tool that in the past nuclear weapon states themselves have used to either create increasingly sophisticated types of nuclear weapons or make sure that their stockpiles remain reliable. There is a treaty that bans nuclear testing that's called the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which was concluded in 1996, but it has not yet entered into force. And we're going to talk about some of the reasons for that a little bit later on. But instead, what we have in place now is a pretty robust international norm against nuclear testing that's been upheld since 1998 by the nuclear weapons possessors, with the exception of North Korea. And so the slide that you're seeing here is actually, it shows the seismic signals of North Korea's 6 declared tests. And this information was compiled by the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, which is the organization that oversees the entry into force of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. It also oversees the International Monitoring System, which is a global system of facilities that monitors for nuclear tests worldwide. And so the information that you're seeing on the screen is compiled on the basis of data that that system has gathered. So the international non-proliferation regime broadly, and where we are today with that, is something we're going to be discussing throughout this presentation. But in general, we can conclude that it's been relatively successful at preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. It might surprise you to know that many states have actually explored nuclear weapons programs. These include Brazil, South Korea, Switzerland, Thailand, Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya, many others, 20+ states. In recent years, however, we've heard a lot about 2 primary concerns that I'm sure you're aware of. The first of these is Iran, and the second is North Korea. So with respect to the Iran deal, with respect to Iran, we do have a deal in place called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that is designed to limit Iran's nuclear program. And this was concluded in July of 2015 between the P5, so the countries that we've talked about before, and also Germany. And these countries agreed to lift sanctions on Iran if Iran would agree to abide by certain limitations on its nuclear program and allow increased monitoring by what is sometimes called the World Nuclear Watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Agency. This deal was concluded in response to longstanding concerns among some in the international community that Iran was developing a nuclear weapon, and it's been widely hailed as a major accomplishment of multilateral non-proliferation diplomacy. And we'll talk a little bit about what's going on with this deal later on. Now, with regard to North Korea, this is a very abbreviated history of this issue, but essentially in the 1990s, the DPRK operated a nuclear weapons program in violation of a freeze agreement that it had concluded with the United States. In 2003, it withdrew from the main treaty that governs non-proliferation, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it successfully carried out a nuclear test in 2006. So fast forwarding several years, in July of this current year, North Korea carried out a successful test of an intercontinental ballistic missile, which is a delivery vehicle for essentially 4 nuclear weapons. And in September of this year, it carried out a significantly more powerful nuclear weapons test. And in fact, if we go back one slide, you can see that the September 3rd test has a much larger seismic signal compared with the other tests that North Korea undertook previously. So the rhetoric between Pyongyang and Washington has been escalating since January of this year, and it remains to be seen exactly how that will be resolved, but we'll do a little bit of speculating about that later on in the presentation. So we've talked about where we are right now, and we've kind of taken a look at some of the non-proliferation successes and challenges that we face at the moment. So now we're going to back up and examine how it is that we got here. So it is probably obvious, but nuclear weapons are very old technology. And in fact, they were developed in the 1940s. So way before cell phones, way before computers, any of that. 1942 marked the establishment of the Manhattan Project, which was the US program to develop a nuclear weapon. And in 1945, the United States detonated the first nuclear weapon in a test codenamed Trinity. And this was undertaken as part of the Manhattan Project. And it was a test of what's called an implosion device made using plutonium. In 1945, of course, there were the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which marked the use of nuclear weapons, the only time that nuclear weapons have been used in war. And by that next year, in 1946, the UN General Assembly adopted its first resolution, which called for the elimination of nuclear weapons. Now, in spite of this, in 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear weapon. In 1952, the United Kingdom tested. In 1960, France tested. And in 1964, China tested. So what this highlights is that there's a longstanding tension between recognition that these are dangerous weapons that must be controlled, but states also wanting to develop them themselves as a way to make them more secure and to advance their national interests. So amidst this tension, and in part because of it, you saw the development of what was called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. And this was a theory that was put forth by the US Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, in 1962, where he determined that if the United States were to be attacked by the Soviet Union, it would need to have enough of a nuclear arsenal, not only to survive an attack, but then to come back and destroy the USSR. And so really what this theory meant is that neither country was advantaged by attacking the other first. So this kind of gave rise to the theory that we now know today as deterrence. On the basis of the theory of deterrence and the theory of mutually assured destruction, there was a massive, massive buildup of both countries' nuclear arsenals, which really reached a peak in about 1986, where the number of warheads in the world topped out at more than 69,000. And in correspondence with this buildup and with the increase of arms, nuclear weapon states increasingly factored nuclear weapons into their defense doctrines, which helped to codify the role of deterrence in national security. And then you have some other countries as well that developed their own nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons programs in order to deter attacks. And that is how we arrived at the numbers that we talked about in the first part of the presentation. So both the United States and the USSR recognized, even during the midst of the Cold War, when everything was so tense in the bilateral relationship, that the arms race was unstable, it was unsustainable, and it would increase the likelihood of an accidental or a deliberate nuclear war. And so they took some steps to address this. Now, in 1963, following the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States and the Soviet Union signed a memorandum of understanding that established a hotline between the two of them so that they could communicate in times of crisis and help to avoid the kinds of miscalculations and miscommunications that would lead to war. Under Richard Nixon, the United States undertook new weapons development, but it simultaneously pursued agreements with the Soviet Union on limits to their nuclear arsenals and multilateral treaties that were aimed at preventing the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries beyond those two. This led to some important arms control agreements that lay the groundwork for where we are today. In 1969, for example, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty talks began, the SALT talks, and these yielded both the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which was an important treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union, but also an agreement between the two countries to limit both their ICBMs, their intercontinental ballistic missiles, and their SLBMs, their submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And this agreement focused on the number of delivery systems rather than the number of warheads in the arsenal. So both sides were able to use this to their advantage in order to expand their arsenals while at the same time agreeing to lower numbers of delivery systems. And they would do this by mounting more warheads on a single intercontinental ballistic missile or submarine-launched ballistic missile, thereby allowing them to increase the number of warheads that they had while still falling under the limits of the treaty. In 1991, you have the START I treaty negotiated, and this was the first arms control treaty that counted the number of warheads in addition to the number of delivery systems in establishing its limits. So it helped avoid the workaround that you saw in the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty talks. It also had a very robust verification mechanism to ensure that delivery systems were being destroyed according to the terms of the treaty. And this treaty expired in 2009. In 2010, the new START treaty was signed, and it entered into force the next year. And in part in keeping with the Obama administration's expressed interest in non-proliferation and in disarmament, the New START treaty really cut the number of delivery vehicles and warhead limits from the levels they had been at previously. And it incorporated aspects of the very staunch verification regime that was part of the START I treaty into this new treaty. So we'll talk about what this will look like in a little bit, but essentially the two sides now need to decide whether they want to extend that treaty, whether they want to let it expire, or whether they want to negotiate a follow-on, and there are several factors that will go into that decision. So with regard to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, even before the Cuban Missile Crisis and before the arms race with the Soviet Union, JFK, the US President John F. Kennedy, had expressed concern about the potential that more states would begin to acquire nuclear weapons. And in fact, in his 1960 debate with Richard Nixon, he speculated that by 1964, as many as 20 nations would have the capacity, would have nuclear arsenals. Now, of course, that didn't turn out to be true, but part of the reason for this was that both the United States and the Soviet Union really made a concerted effort to develop mechanisms to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons to states that didn't already have them. So in 1968, we see the culmination of these efforts in a multilateral treaty called the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. It was negotiated by the United States, the USSR, and the United Kingdom, and it was ratified 2 years after it opened for signature in 1970. So we'll talk a little bit more about what this treaty looks like on Friday on my next lecture, but in short, it's comprised of 10 articles, and these articles are designed to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons to those states that don't already have them, while obligating those states that do have them to disarm. And it is the thing that codifies the 5 nuclear weapon states that we talked about before. So the US, the USSR, the United Kingdom, France, and China. The definition of nuclear weapon states under this treaty, in quotes, is those states that tested a nuclear weapon before January 1st of 1967. It does not really provide a mechanism to bring in those states that we've discussed before who are not part of the treaty into the treaty unless they join as non-nuclear weapon states, which would mean disarming first. So the question is that possible? Is it possible to universalize the treaty? It's difficult to say, but there are 4 states that have given up their nuclear weapons in the past, and this does set a bit of a precedent. The first of these is South Africa. South Africa developed 6 nuclear weapons. It then dismantled them and then joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state. And the others are the former Soviet republics of Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. And it might surprise you to hear that, but under the Soviet Union, the nuclear weapon arsenals of those countries were distributed among the satellite countries. So there were nuclear weapons based in Ukraine, in Kazakhstan, and Belarus that, following the disintegration of the USSR, needed to be repatriated to Russia. And those countries agreed to do that, and this was a very big deal. And then they joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty as non-nuclear weapon states. So the treaty itself was originally set out to only last for a period of 25 years. So in 1995, it came up for review, and states parties needed to decide whether they wanted to let the treaty expire or extend it indefinitely or extend it for another fixed period. And they did decide to extend it indefinitely. So every year since that and every 5 years before that, the treaty is reviewed in 5-year cycles, and states parties come together at these meetings to evaluate both how the treaty has been implemented in the past and then to also explore ways to better implement it in the future. And this is a consensus agreement, so they all need to be in agreement about how to do this. And as you can imagine, that's very challenging when you have 190 countries that all have very different threat perceptions and different national interests. The treaty itself is called the cornerstone of the non-proliferation regime, but because of the issues that I just outlined, the need for consensus among states with different interests, it's often perceived to be in trouble. And a central tension is that the states who do not possess nuclear weapons feel that they have implemented their responsibilities more faithfully than the states who do possess nuclear weapons. And so that's a central tension with which these states are wrestling. So proposals for limiting nuclear testing, which, as you remember, has long been perceived as a key component of developing nuclear arsenals, began as early as the 1950s, so they're not new. The Limited Test Ban Treaty, which is also called the Partial Test Ban Treaty, was negotiated over a period of 8 years between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it was finally concluded in 1963. And this treaty bans nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere and outer space and underwater, but it does not ban underground nuclear tests, which is how most modern nuclear weapon states would conduct their testing. This treaty was followed in 1974 by the Threshold Test Ban Treaty, which put a limit on the yield of nuclear tests that can be conducted. So nothing more than 150 kilotons could be conducted. The Peaceful Nuclear Explosions Treaty was similarly concluded in 1977, and Both of these treaties were very challenging to verify. It's very difficult to make sure that a country isn't conducting nuclear tests and somehow evading detection. So they weren't ratified until much, much later in the 1980s and 1990s. Following their ratification in 1993, there was a committee established in the United Nations to start negotiating a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty. So that means one that would ban all nuclear tests, not just those, in the atmosphere or in outer space or underwater, but those that are underground as well. And this had been an objective of the international community for a really long time, but finally in the mid-1990s, for a variety of reasons, there was enough political will to make this happen. So in 1996, this treaty was concluded and opened for signature. And although, as we've said before, there's a nuclear test moratorium that's largely observed by almost all of the nuclear weapons countries today, the treaty still hasn't entered into force. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is and what some prospects are for ratification a bit later on. Okay, so here we're coming into the more forward-looking portion of the presentation. And the first topic that we're going to turn to is the future of arms control, and specifically the future of the New START Treaty. So you'll remember this is the treaty that was concluded in 2010 by the United States and the Russian Federation. It established some pretty major cuts to both countries' nuclear arsenals. Under the New START Treaty, both Russia and the United States can have 700 deployed intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and heavy bombers that are equipped for nuclear armaments. They can have 1,550 nuclear warheads on deployed ICBMs, deployed SLBMs, and deployed heavy bombers that are equipped for nuclear armaments. And each of these bombers counts as one warhead towards this limit under the treaty. And at the same time, they can have 800 deployed and non-deployed ICBM launchers, SLBM launchers, and heavy bombers that are equipped for nuclear armaments. So the treaty itself lasts for a term of 10 years, but it can be extended for up to 5 years. And if the treaty doesn't get extended, this will really mark the first time since about the 1960s that we haven't had an arms control agreement either in place with Moscow or one that's in the process of being negotiated between the United States and Russia. And as the countries that have the two largest nuclear arsenals, this begs the question, what will this mean for the Non-Proliferation Treaty and for the non-proliferation regime more broadly? What would it mean for the stability of US-Russia relations? And could this lead to the emergence of a new arms race? We're also focusing quite a bit on the United States and Russia, but what about other countries that possess nuclear weapons? Is there a prospect for other states to begin to disarm and dismantle their nuclear weapons arsenals, or will the focus remain on the United States and Russia, even if they're not able to make progress in this area at this particular moment? So there are two big factors that influence how we think about the prospects for New START. The first is US-Russia relations. As we know, relations between the two countries right now are in what some are calling a new Cold War. There's not a lot of interaction at high levels between US and Russian officials, and non-proliferation cooperation has almost ceased completely between the two countries right now. So how will that impact arms control and the potential for an extension of New START? The other thing that we don't know quite yet is what the US nuclear posture will be under the new administration here. So we're awaiting a nuclear posture review in the United States, and that will provide more insight into how the administration regards arms control and what kinds of efforts it's willing to make in that regard. So we started the presentation talking about fissile material, which you'll remember is the material used to make nuclear weapons. And since about 1978, the international community has been thinking about ways and calling for ways to cease the production of fissile material for nuclear weapons purposes. Now, this hasn't gone anywhere for quite some time, in spite of the fact that Starting in the 1990s, there were many resolutions and many mandates to negotiate what's called a fissile material cutoff treaty or a fissile material treaty. And one of the reasons why it's been so difficult to make progress on this issue is that the Conference on Disarmament, which is the multilateral negotiating body on disarmament in the United Nations, has not been able to agree on a program of work since 1996. And so this means that it hasn't been possible to start negotiations on a fissile material cutoff treaty or fissile material treaty. And one of the central issues is that this is a body that operates on consensus. And Pakistan, along with a number of other states, want to be sure that a fissile material cutoff treaty doesn't just cap the future production of fissile material, but that it includes current stocks in calculating how much fissile material a country could have. And this concern stems in part from worries that a fissile material cutoff treaty would disadvantage certain countries over other countries in terms of how much fissile material they are allowed to have. So there's been a little bit of forward movement in this space. In March of 2017, we saw the first session of a high-level fissile material cutoff treaty expert preparatory group meet in New York City. 25 states have joined this group, although Pakistan is not among them. The group is going to continue to meet in 2018 and to make recommendations about the substantial elements of a future fissile material cutoff treaty. So we'll have to see what this means for the future of this kind of an effort. Also this year, a working group under the title The Way Ahead was established in the Conference on Disarmament to try to figure out how to move forward and how to agree on a program of work. So the two questions to consider here are, can these two developments actually lead to progress on a fissile material cutoff treaty or a fissile material treaty? And will it ever be possible to make progress on this issue in a forum that requires consensus? So those are two things to contemplate. So the CTBT, I hinted about this a little bit earlier, but again, this is the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. The CTBT was opened for signature in 1996, but it has not entered into force 21 years later. And part of the reason for this is that the CTBT has a very high threshold for entry into force. It requires 44 states to ratify the treaty in order for it to enter into force. And 8 more of these states need to ratify in order for this to happen. And this, may surprise you to know, includes both the United States and North Korea. So again, we're still awaiting the nuclear posture review in the United States, but it seems potentially unlikely that progress is going to be made in this issue during the next 4 years. Nevertheless, there are some steps that states can take, even if ratification among the 8 remaining states isn't possible. So one example of steps that states could take would be to build international monitoring system facilities like the one that you can see in this image here, and link them up to the international monitoring system that's been developed by the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. So this would be a step towards showing a country's interest in supporting the message of the CTBT without necessarily obligating them to take the step to ratify if that's not possible at the moment. The real questions to consider, though, as we're looking forward are, if North Korea needs to ratify the treaty in order for it to enter into force, do you think that this will happen, especially given that they're the only country right now that's testing nuclear weapons? In what ways does it make a difference that there is already a pretty robust norm for not testing among the other nuclear weapons states? Does it make states more or less likely to ratify the CTBT if they feel like nobody is testing at this moment anyway? So those are a couple of things to consider. The Non-Proliferation Treaty's upcoming review cycle, you'll remember I mentioned that the Non-Proliferation Treaty is reviewed in 5-year increments. So we have our next big review conference meeting in 2020. But in the meantime, states are gathering each year to start to develop recommendations and make progress towards the 2020 review cycle. This is going to be a particularly interesting set of meetings because, as you may know, and I'm sure you'll hear more about in the coming days, there is a new treaty that's been negotiated just this past year prohibiting nuclear weapons. So it bans them and is designed to make them illegal. The civil society organization, in fact, that was a big part of this movement just won the Nobel Prize, so you may have heard about it in the news. However, there's tension between some of the states who are party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and some of the states who support the new nuclear weapons ban treaty. So some of these states, including the nuclear weapons states under the NPT, are concerned that the new treaty is going to undermine the NPT. And other states feel as though if the pace of disarmament had not been so slow in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, there wouldn't have been a need to develop this additional treaty to ban nuclear weapons. So this will probably be a big topic of conversation in the 2020 NPT review cycle, and we may see some butting of heads between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states and the allies of the nuclear weapon states. There are also two major non-proliferation challenges that we started out talking about that continue to be developing even as we speak. The first is, of course, the situation in North Korea. This is a very tense situation that is evolving continuously. North Korea maintains that it needs a nuclear arsenal in order to deter the United States from attacking it. And the United States, meanwhile, continues to insist that North Korea disarm and that the Korean Peninsula be free of nuclear weapons. We'll have to see exactly what happens here. Just this week, the United States was conducting naval drills in the Pacific with Seoul and Tokyo, and US President Donald Trump has placed a considerable emphasis on the threat posed by North Korea during his tour of Asia, which is going on right now. So we'll need to see exactly what ends up happening with this particular situation, but it's certainly tense and one that's evolving constantly. We're also faced at the moment with a situation in which the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran deal, could potentially unravel. As you may know, President Trump has not certified the deal, which means that Congress needs to decide whether to re-implement sanctions on Iran. We don't know whether this means that the Iran deal itself will fall apart. We don't know what Congress will decide, and we don't know whether the other states who were integral in concluding the deal would maintain it absent the United States, although it seems very likely that this would happen. So this is something that we'll have to keep an eye on, and two issues that are absolutely going to be of central importance in the 2020 NPT review cycle. So the questions to consider here are, will these issues eliminate the potential for consensus at the NPT? Will states parties be able to agree on how they talk about Iran and how they talk about North Korea and how they talk about these challenges to the non-proliferation regime? How will they impact the health of the non-proliferation regime in general if it seems as though this cornerstone treaty is not as strong as it once was or is potentially even disintegrating? So those were the issues I wanted to make sure to cover. I wanted to start with a synopsis of where we are today. I wanted to back up a little bit and look at some of the historical treaties and agreements that led to where we are right now. And I wanted to do some speculating with you about what some major issues are that are going to come up in the near future. But I think in general, we can conclude that yes, there are many, many nuclear weapons today, but there used to be a lot more. There are also significant opportunities for further progress, particularly if states are willing to work with one another, if the US-Russia relationship doesn't interfere too much, but there are also some major challenges to non-proliferation and to disarmament. We also thought a little bit, and will continue to think during the coming week, about how regional and international security issues impact prospects for non-proliferation and disarmament, and how this changes states' threat perceptions and their willingness to disarm or not to develop nuclear weapons. One thing that we didn't talk a lot about, but we did mention when we talked about fissile materials, is what about non-state actors? How do we think about nuclear security with respect to making sure that terrorists and other non-state actors do not get a hold of these weapons? Are there lessons that can be learned from the past? So as we discussed, the United States and the Soviet Union were able to cooperate in non-proliferation and disarmament even at a time when relations were very challenging. Can we derive some lessons from that to apply to the situation today? And then last but not least, any questions that you might have. And I know that Masako is poised to ask some questions, but if any of you have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you. That was a really comprehensive and a great overview of the current nuclear situation and history. So for those who are watching the videos, I think this is a really great overview and a review for those who have studied nuclear issues a little bit. But I just want to ask quite basic questions. So currently we have a so-called official nuclear, 5 official nuclear weapons: US, Russia, UK, France, and China. And the United States is the first country to conduct nuclear weapons testing. So then now we have a non-NPT nuclear weapon state. So I know there are many reasons why countries want to possess nuclear weapons. But could you share your view? I think you might have touched upon, but could you reiterate your thoughts on the main reason why countries would like to possess nuclear weapons, and maybe why countries gave up to possess nuclear weapons? So.
Sure. So that's a great question, and I think it's one that deserves a lot of thought and consideration, because this plays into thinking about what effective measures could be to prevent proliferation and to advance disarmament. One issue that we did not really speak about here, but that often is considered to be quite important, an important reason why states develop nuclear weapons, is prestige. So I mentioned at the beginning that these are complex weapons and ones that are difficult to develop. And if countries are able to develop a nuclear weapon, there's an element of prestige in that for them, or at least that's the perception. I think also one of the sort of dilemmas, the philosophical dilemmas of deterrence theory, is that in order to protect yourself from being attacked by a nuclear weapon, you need to develop your own nuclear weapon. And so many states, particularly in the dawning of the nuclear era, saw that as the only way to really protect themselves against attack from another nuclear weapon state. The calculus has changed a little bit today, in fact, quite a bit today. There are incentives for states not to develop nuclear weapons, and in fact, the NPT plays a really important role in making sure that just because states don't develop a nuclear weapon doesn't mean that they won't have access to peaceful nuclear energy and the other types of civilian benefits that you can get from a nuclear program. In addition, we've developed a system of extended deterrence where the nuclear weapon states pledge to protect those states that don't have nuclear weapons from attack, in the hopes that this will prevent them from feeling the need to develop their own nuclear arsenals. So I think those are some of the main reasons why states might have in the past developed nuclear weapons, and some of the reasons why they might not feel as much of a need to do so right now.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, you mentioned deterrence to protect country. I think North Korea is a great example. North Korea developed nuclear weapons so that United States is not going to attack North Korea. Mm-hmm. So this is a very difficult issue. So that's why it's so difficult to come up with a great idea how we could disarm North Korea. But maybe this is going to be another lecture, lecture. But so going back to more historical aspect, so India, if I remember correctly, India is the first country to propose, or maybe India was quite active in disarmament, but decided not to Non-Proliferation Treaty. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I feel it's important to understand why India continues to oppose to join the NPT. Mm-hmm. Would you?
Sure. So
about the India's reason why not to join the NPT?
Well, I'll say at the outset that I am not a specialist on the subcontinent, but my perception is that one of the problematic aspects of the NPT is that it kind of codifies a system of what you would call nuclear haves and nuclear have-nots. So the countries that possess nuclear weapons under the provisions of that treaty can only be those 5 that tested before January 1st of 1967. And India does not fit into this category. It tested later, maybe in 1974, but definitely in 1998. And as a result, it would have to disarm in order to join the NPT. And from this standpoint, it's kind of, it interferes with their national sovereignty because they do not feel that they're in a position to disarm, and they don't feel that they should have to in order to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So this is one of the kind of central, it's both a strength of the treaty. It limits strictly the number of nuclear weapon states that you can have under the treaty, but it's also something that states who are looking from the outside perceive as a great inequity in the treaty. You have those states that are allowed to possess nuclear weapons legally, and everybody else is prevented from having them. So I think that's a central reason why the treaty has faced difficulty in becoming universal.
Thank you so much. And you also mentioned extended deterrence. That is also a very important concept to understand when we study nuclear non-proliferation. And my home country, Japan, is one of the typical examples of the country that is protected under the US nuclear umbrella. So could you also talk a little bit about NATO, NATO's nuclear arrangement, like basically the nuclear sharing arrangement with the United States?
Sure. So in essence, NATO, there are US nuclear weapons that are based in other countries and other NATO countries, but the United States retains control over when they can be used and when they could possibly be deployed. So those countries that actually host those nuclear weapons are not able to launch them by themselves. But this is an issue that has been problematic for the Non-Proliferation Treaty for a long time, even from before the time that it was had entered into force and had been concluded, because one of the central tenets of the treaty says that nuclear weapon states cannot give non-nuclear weapon states nuclear weapons. And so there was a great deal of discussion, particularly during the time that the treaty was being negotiated, but even sometimes now when the treaty is being reviewed, about whether NATO nuclear sharing violates this provision of the NPT. And as we kind of discussed before, it really depends on the perspective from which you're looking, because from one standpoint, yes, it's a violation of the treaty to give a non-nuclear weapon state nuclear weapons, but if you are retaining control over them, is that really the same as giving another country a nuclear weapon? That's the first question. And second of all, in what ways does extended deterrence change the threats that non-nuclear weapon states feel? So Masako mentioned Japan. Without the US nuclear umbrella, would Japan ever perceive a need to develop its own nuclear arsenal? What would other countries feel? that really changes the calculus in terms of their security strategy, I think, to know that there is US extended deterrence.
Thank you. So the last question that you are expert on the US and Russia, USSR, Soviet. So this is perhaps no one knows the answer, but could you share your view on the prospect on the US-Russian relationship and how it is going to affect the future nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation? It's $1 million question, but
that's a tough question that you saved for the end, Masako. You know, I think it is very hard to say what's going to happen next. On the one hand, as I mentioned during the presentation, and as something that I've studied quite a bit, there was incredible non-proliferation cooperation and arms control cooperation during the height of the Cold War, even when relations were very, very bad between both countries. I think there are some lessons that you can derive for today from this history, but I'm reluctant to act as though the two situations are exactly parallel. I think one thing that we forget is that during the Cold War, the United States, leaders in the United States and leaders in the Soviet Union communicated very frequently at a high level. And so even if their political relationship wasn't good, there was a lot of interpersonal relationship between the actors who were practicing policy and also making policy. And from my perspective, from my vantage, I don't see that same type of interaction today. I will say, I think a lot of several important organizations are really making efforts to develop the next cadre of experts on US-Russia issues. CNS does this quite frequently, as does the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. They have a dual degree program that's designed to help cultivate this kind of expertise between Russian and American students. But whether those people will enter the field in time to make a difference right now remains to be seen. But I do think without, frequent conversation and frequent interaction, it's going to be very difficult to pursue the types of ambitious arms control and non-proliferation accomplishments that really came out of the Cold War today. There needs to be conversation on a person-to-person level and on a practitioner and policymaker level as well.
Okay, on that positive note, I know it's very difficult, but looking at brighter side, as Sarah mentioned, now, like our organization, we are focusing on youth education. And for this particular critical issues forum, we engage US and Russian students as well as Japanese students. Mm-hmm. So one thing is sure is nuclear disarmament, the world free of nuclear weapons. This is a long way to go. Even if a ban treaty entered into force, but this is still a very, very long way to go. So that's why it's so important for the young generations to be engaged in this issue. So on that positive note, I would like to conclude this important first lecture. So thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing your views and wonderful lecture. And if you have any question for those who are watching the videos, please feel free to email me. And I guess I need to get more insight from experts like Sarah to respond to you. So if you don't mind, so please let me know if you have any questions, and I would like to continue our conversation. So thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.